There are places in this world that hold on to their secrets the way still water holds on to the dark. Places where the trees grow so thick and so close together that sunlight barely touches the surface below, and where the sounds of the outside world fade away until there is nothing left but the slow drip of moisture, the distant call of an unseen bird, and the quiet, patient waiting of whatever lives beneath the surface. These are the places where things disappear. Animals. People. Stories. Memories. All swallowed whole and kept down in the mud, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, sometimes forever. Tonight, we are going to wade into those places together. We are going to walk into the swamps, into the bayous, into the dark and tangled edges of the American wilderness, and we are going to listen carefully to what those places have to say. Because as anyone who has spent real time out in those wild and waterlogged corners of the country will tell you, the swamps are never truly silent. They just make you work a little harder to hear what they are trying to tell you. The stories you are about to hear tonight come from real people, ordinary men and women who were simply going about the business of living their lives when the wilderness reached out and handed them something they were never quite prepared for. A woman doing her job out in the Florida wetlands, pulling up samples from the muddy bottom, when something rose to the surface that changed her forever. A grandfather's voice from the past, telling the tale of a small Mississippi town gripped by fear and shadow during the Second World War, when pale figures moved through the cypress trees at night and people simply vanished into the dark water. A great-grandmother's story of a Louisiana lawman who walked into the bayou with grief in his heart and justice in his hands, and never walked back out again. And a fishing trip that started with a dropped beer and ended with a bite mark that nobody could explain and everybody talked about for years. These are not ghost stories, exactly. They are something harder to put a name to. They are true accounts of real encounters with the unknown, the unexplained, and the deeply, deeply disturbing. The kind of stories that stay with you long after the telling is done. The kind that come back to you in quiet moments, when you are standing somewhere that feels just a little too still, or looking down into water that goes just a little too dark. So settle in, friends. Get comfortable. Turn the lights up if you need to. And let's get into it together, because tonight, the swamp has some things it wants to share. If this is your first time joining us here, welcome. We are so glad you found us. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you never have to miss a single story, and tap that notification bell so you always know when something new is waiting for you. Our first story tonight comes from a woman named Annie, and she tells it the way someone tells a story they have been carrying for a long, long time. Not because they want to unburden themselves exactly, but because they know the story deserves to be told. Because there was a child involved. And someone should remember. My name is Annie. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but for the past 20 years or so, I have been living and working down in Florida, specifically in the Big Cypress National Preserve. After I finished my degree in environmental science up at Penn, I packed up my life and headed south to start a master's program. And to put it as simply as possible, my research was all about how water levels affect cypress domes. It sounds dry when you describe it that way, but once you are out there in the middle of that wild and ancient landscape, with the black water reflecting the sky and the cypress trees rising up around you like old cathedral columns, you start to understand why a person would dedicate their life to studying it. After a few years working out in the field, filing wetland permits and helping state agencies monitor the health of these ecosystems, I came across a job listing on the USA Jobs website for a permanent position with the National Park Service at Big Cypress. Now, government research jobs are incredibly competitive. And that is because you are essentially being paid to spend your days doing the exact thing you are most passionate about, which is not something most people ever get to say about their work. But being competitive has never stopped anyone from throwing their hat in the ring, myself included. And with my fieldwork experience giving me a real edge over some of the other applicants, I managed to land the position. My work involves a healthy amount of time sitting in front of spreadsheets and coordinating with various state agencies, but the fieldwork is what keeps me going. That has always been my favorite part of the job, the part that makes all the rest of it worth doing. Out in the field. I might spend a day tracking water levels across different areas of the preserve, or hunting down and mapping invasive species like the Brazilian pepper tree, which spreads fast and crowds out the native plants if you let it. Other times I help plan and coordinate prescribed burns, which are controlled fires used to keep the pine woods healthy and prevent larger, more destructive wildfires from taking hold. And then sometimes I will spend a day counting wading birds or alligators, trying to figure out whether the canal plugging and rehydration projects that the park has invested so much time and money into are actually making a real difference to the ecosystem, or whether all of that effort has been for nothing. It is hard, physical, sweaty work. The Florida heat is relentless and the bugs are, without question, the absolute worst part of the job. But knowing that the work I am doing is helping to preserve this incredible, wild piece of the world makes every bit of the discomfort worth it. Even when things get difficult out there. Even when things get dark. And this is the story of the darkest and most disturbing thing that has ever happened to me in my entire career. When we are doing fieldwork out in the deep swamps, we rely on airboats to get us where we need to go. At the time, mine was a 14-foot aluminum flat bottom, powered by a big, growling aircraft engine mounted at the rear inside one of those large propeller cages. You have almost certainly seen the type. It was extraordinarily loud, the kind of loud that makes conversation impossible unless you are shouting directly into someone's ear. But that noise served a purpose, because it kept the alligators away from the boat, and in the Florida swamps, that is a very real and very practical concern. And beyond the safety of it, the airboat could take you places that a traditional boat simply could not access. Shallow water, thick vegetation, areas that would be completely impassable in anything with a conventional hull. It was far more useful than paddling around in a canoe, especially for collecting the kind of detailed sediment samples that my work required. I used to head out first thing in the morning, before the heat of the day had fully settled in, when the water was still and smooth and the light was just beginning to warm up at the edges. I would go out to my pre-selected sampling sites carrying what we call poners. A poner is a small, hinged device, sort of like a clamshell grabber, that you lower down into the water on a cord. You let it sink all the way down into the muck at the bottom, and then after several days, when it has settled in and collected a good layer of that soft, silty material from the swamp floor, you gently haul it back up to the surface. The key word there is gently. The whole point of the exercise is to capture that bottom layer in as undisturbed a state as possible, without stirring up the water column and contaminating the data you are trying to collect. It requires patience and a careful touch. Half the time, of course, the equipment gets snagged on something below the surface. A root, a submerged branch, a cluster of vegetation wrapped around a cypress knee. In a swamp, there is no shortage of things for a line to catch on. But over the years I had developed a pretty reliable technique for dealing with it. You give the cord a little extra slack, let the weight of the device shift, and usually that is enough to work it free. But on this particular morning, on my fourth retrieval of the day, the cord simply would not come free. No matter how much slack I gave it, no matter how carefully I worked the line back and forth, whatever had hold of that poner was not letting go. I leaned over the side of the boat and looked down into the water. I am not entirely sure why I did that. The water in the swamp is dark and murky, and you cannot see more than a few inches below the surface. I suppose it was just an instinct, that human urge to look at a problem even when looking at it will not help you solve it. I wiggled the cord again. And as I was doing it, I was thinking to myself that it could not be a cypress knee holding it, because I was positioned too far out from the bank for that. And it could not be roots either, for the same reason. But then, with one final gentle pull, the line suddenly came loose with a strange sensation, almost like a soft popping feeling running up through the cord and into my hands. I breathed out with relief and began slowly, carefully drawing the line up toward the surface. Pulling inch by inch, waiting to see the familiar shape of the poner appear just below the waterline. But something else appeared first. Something larger. Something pale and bloated. Something that floated up from the dark water and broke the surface right there in front of me. I threw myself backward into the boat so hard and so fast that I genuinely believe I would have capsized a smaller vessel. My whole body was reacting before my mind had fully processed what my eyes were seeing. And when I steadied myself and forced myself to look again, I thought at first that it might be a deer, or perhaps a wild hog. Large animals do occasionally wander into the swamp and meet bad ends out there. I told myself that is what it was. I held on to that thought for just a moment. And then I looked more carefully. And I knew. It was a human being. The body was grotesquely bloated, the way human remains become after extended time in warm water. The skin had turned a sickly, mottled shade of blue-green. The legs were missing below the knees, taken, almost certainly, by the alligators and snapping turtles and fish that share those waters. And even through all of that horrifying decay, even with all the damage that days or weeks in the swamp had done to what was once a living person, I could tell from the size of the body, from the small, narrow frame of the torso and the proportions of the remaining limbs, that this had been a child. A young child. Somewhere between 6 and 8 years old, as far as I could tell. Whether it had been a little boy or a little girl, I could not say, because the decomposition and the scavenging had been too extensive. The skin, in the places where it remained at all, looked like it was sliding away from the body beneath it. In other places, the flesh was so heavily infested with insects that it appeared to be moving, rippling, as though the body itself were still somehow alive. The face was partially caved in. The eye sockets were dark and empty. A few dark tufts of hair clung to what little remained of the scalp. The whole surface of the body was covered in a thick layer of swamp slime and mud. And the smell. God help me. The smell hit me like a physical force. It was an overwhelming, suffocating wave of sweetly rotten decay mixed with the sulphurous, gassy tang of the swamp itself. A smell so thick and so wrong that every cell in my body recoiled from it. I tried to hold myself together. I told myself to breathe through my mouth. I told myself to stay calm and professional and think clearly. I could not do it. I leaned over the far side of the boat and was violently sick. If you have ever stumbled across something deeply disturbing, something that shook you right down to your foundations, drop a comment below and let us know. You are not alone in this. Sometimes the world shows us things we were never meant to see. After I had emptied my stomach and was clinging to the side of the boat trying to catch my breath, I was still in an absolutely terrible state. My hands were shaking. My heart was hammering. Everything in me was screaming to get away from that spot as fast as possible. And I listened to that voice, even though I probably should not have. I had never, in all my years of working in the wilderness, encountered a dead body before. Not a human one. And certainly not one belonging to a child. I think that is the only way I can explain what happened next, because what I did next was not rational. It was not what a trained professional should do. It was simply what a deeply traumatized human being did when their mind shut down and pure animal instinct took over. I dropped the cord. I left the floater bobbing at the surface so the location would not be lost. And then I drove the airboat back to the dock as fast as that aircraft engine would carry me. I tied up the boat, walked in a daze to my car, and drove myself home. Still in shock. Still barely processing what I had seen. It was only when I was standing in the shower for the second time, scrubbing myself and still unable to shake the sensation that I could smell that smell on my skin, on my hair, everywhere, that I finally started to cry. And I mean really cry. The ugly, gasping kind. Because I realized, standing there under the hot water, that the smell was not on me at all. It had not been for quite some time. What I was still smelling was a memory. A trauma echo. My brain was replaying it on a loop because it did not know how to process what I had experienced and set it aside. Once I had managed to pull myself together enough to function, I dried off, sat down, and called the police. I gave them the exact location of what I had found, which I was able to do precisely because I had left that floater bobbing at the surface when I fled. A deputy I spoke to told me to expect a follow-up call, and true to their word, I received one the next day. I drove over to Everglades City to sit down with a missing persons detective, a no-nonsense man who went through every detail of what I had observed with a methodical intensity. He asked if I had noticed any clothing, any jewelry, any identifying marks or features that might help them figure out who this child was. But I had nothing to offer him. All I could remember with any clarity was that blue-green color, that smell, those empty eye sockets. And the crawling surface of that small, ruined body. The detective and I stayed in touch for a while afterward. I was so badly shaken by what I had found that he told me I could call him for updates, and I took him up on that, holding on to a small, desperate hope that maybe this terrible discovery would bring some resolution to a family somewhere that had been living without answers. That maybe this poor child would be identified, and the people who loved them could finally have some kind of closure, no matter how painful that closure might be. But when the news finally came, it was not good. The decomposition was too far advanced for any usable DNA to be recovered from the remains. And there were no missing child reports that matched either the location or the estimated timeframe. The child was eventually laid to rest under the designation of John Doe, or Jane Doe, unknown. The case went cold. No name. No family. No answers. I was devastated in a way that is hard to fully put into words. The nightmares started almost immediately, and they lasted for a long time. Being out in the field in the weeks that followed was its own particular kind of torture, because every time I leaned over the side of a boat to retrieve a sample, my heart was in my throat. Every dark shape beneath the surface made me flinch. I had hoped that finding that poor child, as horrible as it was, would at least mean something. That it would be the end of some terrible, unresolved chapter in a family story. That someone, somewhere, would finally know. But for it to have amounted to nothing, for that child to remain nameless and unknown, was its own kind of grief. One that settled into me and stayed. Even now, all these years later, I still think about that child sometimes when I am out on the water. I wonder what happened. Whether it was an accident or something far, far worse. I think about the family out there somewhere, people who have probably spent years wondering what became of their child, who will never know the answer. And I think that must be the worst kind of loss there is. Not just losing someone, but losing them without any explanation. Without any ending to the story. I hope they found some peace eventually. I truly do. Our next story takes us back in time, all the way to World War II, to a small Mississippi town with a secret rotting away in the water at its edges. My grandpa was born just shy of 100 years ago, back in 1927, in the town of Canton, Mississippi, when Canton was still a busy and important stop along the Mississippi Central Railroad. He and his family lived on a small plot of land just off the town square, close enough to the tracks that they could hear the trains rolling past at all hours, day and night. The sound of those trains was as much a part of their daily life as the smell of their mother's cooking or the creak of the floorboards in the morning. My great-grandfather, Job, made his living loading and unloading freight from the railroad cars, and for a while, it was honest, steady work that kept the family comfortable enough. But then 1929 arrived, and with it, the Great Depression, and everything changed. By the early 1930s, things had become genuinely desperate for families all across Madison County. Great-grandpa Job picked up whatever odd jobs he could find, sometimes helping maintain and repair the tracks when the railroad company needed extra hands. But the work was irregular, weeks or even months could go by without a steady paycheck, and the family had to find other ways to survive. My great-grandmother took in laundry and ironing, charging $1 or $2 per load from the wealthier families in town who could still afford to pay someone else to do their washing. Meanwhile, the children, my grandpa and his 2 sisters, helped tend a small kitchen garden where they grew okra, green beans, corn, and tomatoes. Supper most nights was cornbread and whatever thin stew meat could be stretched to fill the pot. When money got truly tight, which it did more often than any of them liked to admit, the family would water down condensed milk to make it last longer, or mash up leftover cooked greens with water to create something that barely qualified as soup, a watery, grassy gruel that everyone at the table ate without complaint because there was simply nothing else. There was a food assistance program in Canton during those years, and people would line up for hours in the heat and the dust to receive their allotment of cornmeal, grits, salt pork, and sometimes cheese. My grandpa said that without those distributions, some families in Madison County would have starved outright. It was that simple and that grim. By 1936, Grandpa remembered, the summers that had once been full of play and leisure had become entirely about work. He and his sisters spent their days chopping cotton, picking berries, or hiring themselves out to help neighbors with chores, earning a nickel or two for their labor. At least from the neighbors who had not already packed up and moved on to Jackson or Memphis in search of better opportunities. People were leaving. The town was slowly emptying out. It might have withered away completely if not for the strange and bittersweet salvation that the Second World War eventually brought with it. It probably sounds like a terrible thing to say, and perhaps it is, but the worst war in human history injected new life into a lot of struggling communities across the American South. The railroads became busier than they had been in years, moving men and materials across the country at a frantic pace. My grandpa got to work regular shifts alongside his father, loading and unloading railroad cars at the depot. The money started flowing again. People started talking about the future with something that resembled cautious hope for the first time in a decade. It seemed like things were finally turning around for Canton. And that is exactly when something sinister began. It started when a large group of German prisoners of war were transferred to a facility called Camp Clinton, located just south of Canton. My grandpa said there were approximately 3,000 prisoners held there in total, and he remembered seeing them from time to time, being marched in supervised groups to work on local farms or to resurface sections of road, always under the watchful eyes of armed guards. People in town whispered about them constantly. They were afraid of them. The prisoners were described in hushed and fearful tones as hardened soldiers, dangerous men, men who had fought and killed on the battlefields of North Africa. There were rumors that if they ever managed to break out somehow, they might pour into Canton under cover of darkness and commit all manner of terrible violence. The fear was real and it was widespread, even if, as Grandpa noted with some amusement in hindsight, there was never any organized mass escape attempt from Camp Clinton during the entire time the facility operated. But then 2 soldiers did escape. And the panic that followed was unlike anything Canton had ever seen. American troops began searching the entire surrounding area, sector by sector, working their way methodically through the countryside in jeeps that had been fitted with powerful searchlights mounted in the back where machine guns might normally sit. They moved through the town and the farmland and the fields, eliminating area after area, narrowing the search radius until there was only one place left that they had not yet fully covered. The swampy, waterlogged stretch of land near the Pearl River, just north of the reservoir. And when the soldiers turned their attention to those swamps and conducted as thorough a search of the area as the terrain would allow, they found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a single trace of either escaped prisoner. The men seemed to have stepped into the dark water and simply ceased to exist. Soldiers were overheard speculating that the Germans might have waded into the wrong patch of swamp in the darkness and been taken by alligators. It was as good an explanation as any, and it was the one most people decided to accept. But it was not a comfortable one. And it was not the only unsettling thing happening in Canton at the time. A number of guards from Camp Clinton had taken to spending their off-duty evenings in the bars and shops of Canton, buying cigarettes and candy and enjoying a cold beer after a long day of work. And one night, a couple of those soldiers were in a local bar near closing time when they got to talking with the bartender. They had been part of a nighttime search party sent out into the swamps to try and catch the escaped prisoners while they were moving under cover of darkness. And the 2 of them had seen something out there on the water that had shaken them badly. They had been paddling quietly through the dark, keeping their voices low and their eyes and ears sharp for any sign of the escapees, when one of the soldiers spotted something on a nearby bank that sent a bolt of cold, pure fear straight through him. 3 pale, ghostly figures appeared to hover just above the waterline for a brief moment before vanishing. The soldier gasped and pointed them out to his companions, but by the time they swung their searchlight toward the bank, whatever had been there was gone. The other soldiers thought their friend had simply let the darkness and the tension get the better of his imagination. They teased him about it. Called him a coward. But the soldier was absolutely certain of what he had seen. And the bartender, clearly a man who appreciated a good story, made sure to tell it with some emphasis. And within days, rumors had spread all through Canton that the swamps near the Pearl River were haunted. Grandpa admitted, with the kind of rueful honesty that comes with age, that at 15 years old, he believed it. He was old enough to do the work of a grown man and to take on real responsibilities around the house, but young enough that a story like that one had no trouble taking root in his imagination. Because he thought about it logically, the way a frightened 15-year-old reasons things through. Those two German prisoners had been seasoned combat veterans of the Afrika Korps. Men who had survived war. The idea that they had simply stumbled into a swamp and drowned seemed inadequate. And if they were dead, there would be evidence of it. Bones. Scraps of fabric. Something. Even the gators left something behind. So if those two hard men had simply vanished, what explanation was there, besides something supernatural? Families around Canton started keeping their children away from the swamps. Even some adults began avoiding the area at night, which in a small southern town was no small behavioral change. But not everyone stayed away. A 17-year-old named George Jackson announced, with the full and unearnable confidence of a teenage boy, that he was going to go out into the swamps after dark and find out for himself whether the ghost stories were true. His friends begged him not to go. They pleaded. They argued. But George, who apparently considered himself something of an expert on all matters relating to the spirit world, was unmoved. He told them that spirits were nothing to be afraid of. That they were merely the lingering echoes of departed souls, harmless as smoke. He said for all he knew, he might even run into his own grandfather out there, drifting peacefully among the cypress trees. And with that, off he went into the dark, and he was never seen again. A search party was sent out, made up of sheriff's deputies and local volunteers. They combed through the swamp as thoroughly as they dared. They even dredged sections of the water in hopes of recovering a body. But George Jackson had vanished as completely as the two German prisoners before him, without a trace of any kind left behind. The whole of Madison County was frightened now in a way that went well beyond the usual swamp superstitions. Because while the disappearance of two escaped prisoners of war could be explained away with enough effort, the disappearance of a local boy from a local family, a boy everyone knew, was something else entirely. It was something that defied the comfortable explanations. And the town divided itself into two camps of dread. One half believed the escaped Germans were responsible, that they had been hiding out in those swamps all along and had killed George when he stumbled onto them. The other half believed something far less explainable was at work. That those ghostly figures were real, and that George had discovered the hard way that they were not as harmless as he had assumed. And then, less than a week later, a gator trapper made a discovery that shifted everything. While gutting and skinning one of the animals he had caught, he found human remains inside the stomach. The whole town initially assumed it must be poor George Jackson. And so there was a strange, awful sense of relief, the relief of a community that has been holding its breath, when examination of the clothing fragments found in the animal's stomach revealed that they had come from a German military uniform. Not George. One of the escaped prisoners. People told themselves that George was still out there somewhere. That he had gotten turned around in the swamp and lost, but that he would find his way home any day. It was the story they needed to believe. But George did not come home. And he was not the last person to disappear before the truth finally came to light. About a week after the gator trapper's discovery, a man was driving along the road that ran parallel to the edge of the swamps when he pulled over and stopped. No one ever knew for certain why he stopped. It might have been to use the bathroom. It might have been a concern about his tires. Whatever the reason, he got out of his car, and he never got back in. A highway patrol officer found the vehicle the next morning, still running, sitting empty on the side of the road. A brief search of the area was conducted, with deputies walking the water's edge with shotguns held ready. But no one was willing to go deep into the swamps, not even in daylight hours. Because by now there was no longer any reasonable doubt. Something deeply evil had taken up residence in those swampy, waterlogged miles of cypress and dark water, and nobody wanted to be the next one, it claimed. Hit that like button if this story has you glued to your seat. Share it with a friend tonight. Some stories are better when you are not listening alone. But as it turned out, there was one more person who had no choice but to walk directly into that darkness. His name was Juan Jones. He was in his 20s at the time. A medical condition had kept him out of the military when other young men his age were shipping off to Europe and the Pacific, and so he had stayed home and made himself useful by helping out the women around town whose husbands had gone overseas to fight. He had built himself a decent enough living doing that. But somewhere along the way, Juan had made a very serious mistake in judgment. He was having an affair with a woman whose husband was most certainly not the forgiving type. The husband was fighting overseas, but he had family in town. Brothers, cousins, a whole network of people who would be obligated and more than willing to make Juan's life extremely short and painful if they ever found out what he was up to. And Juan knew that perfectly well and continued anyway. His lover lived out in a place called Sand Hill. Juan would visit her after dark, staying late into the night to minimize the chances of being seen coming or going. But one evening on his way back home, he found the bridge across the reservoir blockaded. Soldiers on one side. And on the other side, sheriff's deputies. Not just any deputies, either. Almost the entire department, and nearly all of them were personal friends or close acquaintances of his lover's husband. If they saw one crossing that bridge at that hour, coming from that direction, the questions would start. And the answers would not go well for him. One knew he could not use the bridge. He stood there in the dark, turning his options over in his head, and came to the conclusion that there was only one alternative route back to Canton that did not involve walking miles and miles along open roads where anyone might see him. He would have to go through the swamps. He knew what had been happening out there. He knew people had been vanishing. He knew that even the sheriff's deputies were afraid to go in after dark. But he weighed that risk against the very certain and very personal danger waiting for him on the other side of that bridge, and he made his choice. He said later that he had never been so frightened in all his life. Every step through that dark, silent water felt like it might be his last. He moved quickly and quietly, giving a wide berth to every shadow that might be a resting alligator, staying as alert as he had ever been in his life. And then, about halfway through, he heard something. A voice, coming from somewhere among the trees ahead of him. At first it was so soft that he thought he might have imagined it. Maybe a gator hissing. Maybe the breeze moving through the moss. But then he heard it again, and this time there was no mistaking it. Someone out there in the dark was saying, "Help me." Juan stopped dead. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to run. To not look toward that voice, to not take another step in that direction, to just get himself out of those swamps as fast as his legs would carry him. But he could not do it. He said afterward that whatever kind of man he was, whatever compromises he had made with his own conscience, he could not leave someone out there in the dark calling for help and simply walk away from them. And so he moved toward the voice. Moving carefully through the moonlight, stepping as gently as he could, guiding himself by sound until he pushed past a cluster of trees and saw something that froze him where he stood. There was a figure standing beside a tree, balanced on top of an old, battered wooden chair. The man was naked. Completely unclothed. And even in the pale wash of the moonlight, one could see that he had been beaten badly. Very badly. His body was a landscape of dark bruises and cuts, his face so swollen and distorted that recognition was nearly impossible at first. And yet, as Juan moved closer, he realized he knew who this was. It was George Jackson. The boy who had walked into the swamps 2 weeks ago and never come home. Juan called out to him, kept his voice low, asked him what in God's name had happened. And George, balanced on that rickety chair with the moonlight on his ruined face, said only 2 words. "I'm sorry." That was when Juan saw the rope. A loop of rough cord around George's neck, disappearing up into the dark of the branches above. And before Juan could move, before he could think, before he could reach for the knife at his belt, a leg shot out from behind the tree beside George and kicked the chair away. The sound that followed was one that Juan said he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And then they came for Juan. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their bodies an eerie, unnatural white in the moonlight. They moved in complete silence. Not a word, not a grunt, not a sound of any kind as they threw themselves at Juan and tried to drag him down to the ground. They were not trying to kill him, he realized with a horror that was almost worse than the alternative. They wanted him alive. They wanted to take him. To do to him what they had done to George. But what those 3 men had not anticipated was that Juan Jones had already had his knife in his hand before they reached him. The moment they put their hands on him, Juan started swinging. And he did not stop. He slashed and he stabbed and he drove that blade into every piece of those men that he could reach, moving with the desperate, savage efficiency of a man who understands with absolute clarity that he is fighting for his life. He brought down 2 of the men before the 3rd turned and fled, bleeding and crashing away through the trees until the sound of his retreat faded into the swamp. But what haunted my grandpa most about that story, the detail that still raises the hair on the back of my neck even now, was not the violence of it. It was the silence. Those 3 men, throughout everything, the struggle and the fighting and the knife going into them, never made a single sound. Not one cry. Not one word. And when the deputies went out the following day and found the bodies, they understood why. The men had stripped down to their underclothes and covered every inch of exposed skin with a paste made from water and white chalk. That was what those soldiers had seen hovering on the bank of the swamp. Not spirits. Not ghosts. Men. Men who had painted themselves white and moved through the dark water in silence, hunting. As for who those men actually were, that question was never satisfactorily answered. Nobody in Madison County recognized either of the dead men. Nobody claimed them as family. Nobody had ever seen them before. They had simply appeared in those swamps, as though they had materialized from nowhere, with the apparent sole purpose of capturing people, torturing them, and ending their lives. Some people said they must have been the escaped German prisoners, because who else would behave in such an alien, incomprehensible way? And it explained nicely why nobody in town recognized them. But Camp Clinton officially denied that either man could have been one of their escaped captives. If that denial was true, and perhaps it was not, then those men remain unidentified to this day. Nameless. Rootless. Utterly unexplained. Making the whole story darker was the fact that it almost went untold. The Office of Censorship was in full operation during the war years, and newspapers across the country had been quietly advised to keep their coverage positive and their stories free of anything that might damage public morale. The editor of the local paper did not dare print a word about any of it. About George Jackson. About the disappearances. About Juan Jones and what he had seen. And so for years, the story existed only in the mouths of people who had been there, passed along in whispers at kitchen tables and on front porches. It was only after the war ended and the censorship office was dissolved that people could begin piecing together what had actually happened out in those swamps during those strange, terrifying months. My grandpa eventually left Mississippi to seek his fortune elsewhere, as so many young men of his generation did. But no matter how far he went or how many years passed, he never forgot. He never forgot poor George Jackson. He never forgot the German prisoners, the gator trappers' grim discovery, and those pale chalk-white figures moving silently through the dark water, hunting human beings for sport. Our third story tonight travels west to the Louisiana Bayou, and it goes all the way back to the time of Prohibition, when the bootleggers owned the night and one lawman decided he had nothing left to lose. My great-grandmother grew up in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. And she lived what can only honestly be described as a remarkable life, though remarkable is perhaps too gentle a word for some of what she experienced. She was born in 1901, just 1 week after a catastrophic August hurricane tore through the region. Her mother called her a miracle baby from the moment she arrived, and said that God had clearly kept her alive for a purpose, most specifically to bring into the world the most beautiful baby born since the infant Jesus himself. And perhaps there was something to the miracle theory, because when Grandma Velma was 4 years old, a devastating yellow fever epidemic swept through the area, killing hundreds upon hundreds of people. Her family, somehow, was spared entirely. She had no memory of the yellow fever, of course. But she remembered clearly the hurricanes that struck Grand Isle and New Orleans when she was 8 and 14. She lived through the First World War and the Spanish flu pandemic, which killed nearly 3,500 people in New Orleans alone. She weathered floods, droughts, the Depression, and more than one war. And she had stories to fill every one of those long years. But the most memorable story she ever told, the one that has stayed in our family like a stone in a shoe, came from the years of Prohibition. The years when the moonshiners and the bootleggers ran their operations out of the deep bayou, and the law came hunting after them, and the whole swampy coast of Louisiana turned into a battlefield. Life in the bayou during those years was hard and beautiful and close to the bone in a way that most people today have trouble imagining. Morning started before sunrise. 5 in the morning in summer, 6 in winter, with the roosters crowing and Cajun mothers calling their children awake. People were poor. Genuinely, bone-deep poor. Grandma Velma used to go out on what they called progs with her older brother, the two of them trapping muskrat or pulling in redfish and speckled trout while their father was at work. The bayou fed them in the most literal sense of the word. But being poor does not mean a person does not want to celebrate. Does not mean they do not want music and dancing and something cold and strong in a tin cup on a warm Louisiana night. And so there was a long, proud tradition of home brewing in the bayou, of fermenting wine and distilling moonshine in backyard stills, of fiddling till dawn with something homemade in your hand. And then Prohibition arrived, and the government made it illegal. The moonshiners did not stop. They moved deeper into the bayou, out into the shadowed tangle of cypress and Spanish moss, and they kept right on working. The Bureau of Prohibition sent agents in after them. And what followed was a running, bloody, dangerous game of cat and mouse that dragged on for years and left bodies floating in the water. The local police chief tried to keep his officers out of it. The conflict between the Bureau and the bootleggers was not his war, and he wanted no part of it. But that position became impossible to hold the night one of his parish officers came stumbling through the door with a bullet in his stomach. The officer had not even been looking for bootleg liquor. He had stopped a driver simply because the man was driving late and erratically, and the officer wanted to make sure he was not intoxicated. But the bootleggers were in a state of total war by that point, and the driver had simply reached for his pistol and fired without thinking twice. He drove off and left the officer bleeding in the road. His fellow officers rushed him to a hospital in New Orleans. He was alive and conscious when they arrived. But the wound was too severe and he had lost too much blood, and he died on the operating table before the night was over. The police chief's name was Henry Herbert, and he was furious. Not just because he had lost a man under his command, but because the man had not even been doing anything related to Prohibition enforcement when he was killed. He had been doing routine police work and it had cost him his life. Chief Herbert knew that the only way to defeat the bootleggers was to win the trust of the parish. Not the trust in his ability to enforce the law, because the people already knew he could do that. What they needed to trust was that he could keep them safe. Because the bootleggers enforced their own rules with violence and terror. Anyone who talked to the law faced real and deadly consequences. Everyone knew what happened to informants. And since nobody was ever entirely sure who was working for the bootleggers and who was not, who was on their payroll as a lookout or a runner or a supplier, the network of fear was total and effective. No tips. No witnesses. No one willing to step forward. Chief Herbert went to the New Orleans Temperance League, a wealthy and influential organization that had every financial reason to want the bootleggers put out of business, and he asked them to fund a reward program for anyone willing to bring useful information to his officers. The league was enthusiastic. Chief Herbert rode up and down Plaquemines Parish making public announcements, letting people know that there was money available for anyone willing to come forward with something real. At first, they received nothing useful. A handful of deliberate misdirections from people trying to throw them off the trail. But then one of his officers came to him with word of a young woman down in Point a la Hatch who wanted to speak with the chief personally. She had something significant to share. She had witnessed a late-night meeting between one of the lead bootleggers and a wealthy financier from New Orleans at the saloon where she worked. She had names. She had details. But she had one condition. She would only talk if the chief's men personally drove her north to Belchasse in the middle of the night, and if they guaranteed the safety of her and her entire family. Chief Herbert gave the order immediately. Drive down, collect the girl, bring her safely north. But when the officer arrived at the address, he found only the girl's mother, beside herself with worry. The girl had not come home that evening. She was found the next morning by a fisherman working near the town of Empire. Her body was floating in the Mississippi River. The whole parish erupted in grief and rage. And Chief Herbert did not wait to be asked what he planned to do about it. He was going into the bayou. He was going to find the first moonshine still he could locate, and he was going to blow it into splinters with the dynamite he was already packing. And any bootlegger unlucky enough to be in the vicinity was going to face whatever justice Chief Herbert personally saw fit to deliver. He waited a few nights to let the bootleggers relax their guard. Then he assembled 6 of his best men, all of them experienced outdoorsmen, armed with rifles, shotguns, and sidearms, and led them out into the swamps under cover of darkness. The chief knew this territory intimately, and the men he had chosen were not the kind to stumble and panic in difficult terrain. They moved through the bayou in absolute silence, cat's paw quiet, going deeper and deeper until the lights of the parish townships disappeared completely behind them and there was nothing around them but water and trees and darkness. After an hour or two, they smelled smoke. They found a moonshiner's shack and closed in around it slowly, getting into position until they had it completely surrounded. Then, on the chief's signal, they rushed in with weapons raised. And found it empty. There was a fire burning under the still. There was a batch of mash sitting in there slowly cooking away. But no moonshiners. No one in sight. And then the shooting started from the trees. One officer went down immediately when a bullet nearly took his arm off. Another was hit moments later when he tried to return fire. The ambush was well planned and well positioned, and Chief Herbert understood in an instant that if his men stayed where they were going to be killed. Every last one of them. He picked up a pistol from one of his wounded men's hands, so that he was carrying one in each, and he ordered all of his remaining officers to open fire simultaneously. The idea was to create enough noise and chaos to allow one man to slip out of the kill zone unnoticed. That man was him. And it worked. The bootleggers were too busy and too excited, too certain of their advantage, to notice that the chief had moved. And when he circled around behind their positions, coming at them from the rear, they had no warning at all. He killed the first group without any of them turning around. He ran to the second group and killed them the same way. Group by group he worked his way through them, attacking from behind with the ruthless efficiency of a man who has accepted that he has passed the point of hesitation, until the survivors finally realized what was happening and fled into the darkness of the bayou. When Chief Herbert rejoined his men, he sent the 2 wounded officers back to town with one able-bodied man to help them, and then led his 3 remaining officers on a sustained rampage through the bayou that lasted through the night and into the following day, blowing up shine shacks and confronting bootleggers wherever they found them. They ran on nothing but adrenaline and the cold certainty of righteous fury. When it was finally over, 11 moonshine operations had been destroyed. When Chief Herbert returned to Belchasse, he told his wife and young daughter to leave. He put them in a car himself, covered them with blankets so no one could see who was being transported, and sent them into New Orleans to stay somewhere safe. He knew that whatever was left of the bootlegger network would come for him in retaliation, and he was not willing to let his family be in the vicinity when they did. Then he slept for a few hours. Then he and his men went back out. They were near the site of the previous night's ambush when one of his officers spotted 2 shapes floating in the water nearby. He figured they were probably bodies of bootleggers from the night before, casualties they had not been able to account for in the chaos. They moved in to take a closer look, and they were nearly on top of the shapes before any of them understood what they were seeing. One of the officers, his voice thick with horror, said quietly, "Oh God, Chief! Don't look! Don't look!" But it was already too late. Chief Herbert had already recognized his wife. Already recognized his daughter. They had been dead for hours. He could see that immediately. He pulled them out of the water anyway. He laid them on the bank and worked over them with frantic, desperate hands, trying to clear their lungs, trying to breathe life back into them. And when he pressed on their chests to push the water out, what came out was not the muddy swamp water he expected. What came out had a sharp, unmistakable chemical sting to it. They had not drowned. They had been murdered before they ever entered the water. And someone had filled their lungs with moonshine before tossing their bodies into the bayou. Take a moment right now. If this story has struck something deep in you, hit that like button. It truly helps us keep telling these stories. And share this with someone tonight who needs to hear it. When Chief Herbert was sure that there was nothing more he could do for them, and that there was no coming back from what had happened, he went very quiet. His officers kept asking him what he wanted to do. What their next move was. What orders he had for them. He did not answer. He was not weeping. He was not visibly broken down. He was simply still, in a way that was harder to witness than grief. Like the part of him that had connected him to the ordinary world of words and plans and decisions had simply gone offline. Switched off. Then, without a word, Chief Herbert lifted his wife onto one shoulder and his daughter onto the other, and walked into the bayou. He was never seen in public again. But people knew he was out there. In the mornings, you would see thin columns of smoke rising from the deeper parts of the swamp, and you would know he had been busy in the night. And they found the bodies too, bodies of bootleggers scattered through the bayou, bearing the evidence of what had been done to them. They were missing their scalps. Missing their noses. Some of them were missing their jawbones entirely, which had a practical purpose that nobody who found them could ignore. It was much easier to fill a dying man's lungs with moonshine when his jaw had been removed. He was giving them the same death his wife and daughter had been given. The killing and the burning went on for weeks. People went out looking for him, trying to find him, trying to bring him back. But he was never found. My great-grandmother knew every corner of that story by heart, because she had heard it told and retold across many years by the man she eventually married. A man named Jacob, who had been one of the officers shot during that ambush, and whom Chief Herbert had gone back to save. That man became my great-grandfather. I never got to meet him. And I only met my great-grandmother when I was too young to form any real memories of her. But knowing their story, knowing what they lived through and what they witnessed, is its own kind of connection. Through knowing our people and our history, we come to know something important about ourselves. Our final story tonight takes a lighter turn. It takes us to the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina, and it starts with a cold beer going overboard and ends with a bite mark nobody can explain. Now I know fishing might not sound like the scariest of subjects on the surface. But trust me when I say this one has some teeth to it. Many years ago, my old friend Earl and I decided to spend a September day out on the water in the Great Dismal Swamp out here in the Carolinas. Now, for those who have never been there, the Great Dismal is exactly what it sounds like. Enormous stretches of dark, still water threaded through with cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, the humidity so thick and heavy that it feels like the air itself is pressing down on you. On a fine day, with good light and a blue sky overhead, it is actually a stunning and beautiful place. But on the kind of overcast, drizzly day we were heading out into, it earns every syllable of that name. It gets genuinely creepy out there in the gray, when the only sound is the soft buzzing of swamp insects near your ear and the occasional plunk of a drop of water falling from the moss into the still, dark water below. But if you want catfish, that kind of weather is exactly what you go looking for. Earl and I had been fishing together since we were barely tall enough to hold a rod properly. We knew the spots. We knew the moods of the water. We loaded the John boat with our rods and tackle, a cooler full of bait including some night crawlers and a batch of stink bait I had mixed up myself, and a sufficient supply of cheap cold beer to make the hours pass pleasantly. We pushed off from the bank around 9:30 in the morning, keeping the motor as quiet as possible so we would not spook whatever was living below the surface. We anchored up in a favorite cove of ours where the water was deep and still, cast out our lines, and settled in. We caught a couple of small ones right away. Nothing memorable, but enough to whet the appetite for something bigger. Things were going along just fine until Earl was in the middle of telling me about a bass he once hooked over at Fontana Lake, a fish he described as being roughly the size of a small hog. He got animated, the way Earl always does when he is telling a story, throwing his arms wide to illustrate some particular moment in the struggle. And in doing so, he knocked his beer cleanly off the edge of the boat. It hit the water with a satisfying splash and immediately began to sink. A trail of bubbles rising up after it in a way that did seem almost mocking. Earl watched it for about half a second. Then he pulled off his boots and his socks, stripped off his shorts, and jumped in after it. I think he had assumed the water would be shallow, the way it is in most parts of that swamp. But we had drifted further out than we realized, because when Earl dropped in, the water came all the way up to his chest. I was laughing, telling him I hoped that beer was worth the trouble, watching him wade over toward where the can had gone under. And then something hit him. The water around him erupted into chaos, churning and rolling like a washing machine on full spin. Earl's arms went wild and he let out a yell that I can still hear clearly if I think about it. Something's got me. My heart went from 0 to somewhere near the roof of my mouth in about a quarter of a second. I grabbed an oar, ready to go after whatever it was, alligator, water snake, God knows what, and leaned over the side of the boat with the oar raised. And Earl came lunging toward me through the churning water, one hand stretched out ahead of him. I grabbed his hand and hauled him up over the side and onto the boat. He laid there gasping on the floor, face the color of a ripe tomato, soaking wet and stringing together a chain of profanity that I will leave to your imagination. I asked him what in the world had gotten hold of him. He just shook his head. He genuinely did not know. We fired up the motor and got out of that cove at a speed that was probably not safe for the boat. Back on solid ground, once we had tied up and Earl had a chance to catch his breath, he rolled up his pant leg to check the damage. Running across the back of his calf was a broad, raw, ugly scrape. Not deep enough to bleed heavily, but rough and red and clearly painful. It was not the mark of any tooth I had ever seen in the ordinary sense. It was not the clean puncture or tear of a bite. It was more like something rough and abrasive had been dragged hard and fast across the skin. Like sandpaper. Like the raspy, bony inner lining of a fish's mouth. I have caught enough catfish in my time to know that mark anywhere. But here is the part that keeps me up at night if I let myself think about it. That scrape ran the entire length of Earl's calf, from knee to ankle. And for a catfish bite to span that distance, the fish would have to be 12 feet long at an absolute minimum. Probably closer to 15. There is no flathead catfish and no channel cat in those swamps that grows anywhere near that size. The record for the region is maybe 5 or 6 feet on a very exceptional catch. What got hold of Earl that day in the Great Dismal would have had to be something far beyond any fish that has any business being in those waters. We got Earl into the truck and drove straight to the hospital, rattling along the back roads while Earl complained at length about the throbbing in his leg. He did not need stitches, as it turned out, but his tetanus shots were badly overdue and they took care of that while they had him there. And Earl, being Earl, spent the entire time in the waiting room telling the whole story to anyone who would hold still long enough to listen. The nurses. The other patients. The man sitting 3 chairs away reading a magazine. All of them got the full account. Word travels fast in a small town. By the weekend, the story had spread through the whole county like a lit fuse burning through powder. Fishermen started showing up at the Great Dismal from all directions, heading for the cove we described. Serious fishermen with sonar equipment and heavy tackle. Retired men who had devoted decades of their lives to this pursuit. all of them hoping to be the one who brought the monster in. Local bait shops sold out of heavy hooks and thick line. The local news picked it up and called it the Dismal Monster Hunt. Earl and I kept our distance from the whole circus and laughed about it from a safe remove. But nobody caught anything. And as the days stretched on without a result, the skeptics got louder. People started saying it was just a tall tale. That Earl had gotten scraped on a branch or a root and the rest of it was storytelling. That hurt a little. It really did. Because we knew what we had seen. We knew what that mark on Earl's calf meant. That catfish is still down there. I have no doubt about it. Those fish live for 80 years easily. Some people say even longer than that. It is down there in the dark water of the Great Dismal, older and bigger and slower than it was that September morning, still living out its quiet, ancient life in the depths. And one of these days, somebody is going to find it again. Or it is going to find them. Until then, Earl and I keep the story between friends. Because we know what's out there, lurking quietly, just below the surface of things. Friends, thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight. If these stories gave you chills, if something in them touched you or made you think, please leave us a comment below and let us know which one stayed with you the most. We read every single one. And if you have a story of your own, something strange or dark or unexplained that happened to you out in the wilderness or somewhere close to home, we want to hear it. Share it in the comments or reach out to us directly. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and hit that notification bell so you are always the first to know when new stories go up. We would love to have you with us for everything that comes next. Because trust me, there is always something else out there in the dark, waiting to be found.